Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at a new post by Yoshi-P over on the Lodestone regarding Abyssos the 8th Circle Savage. For those who may have missed it, in patch 6.21, this fight was nerfed. A fight has not been nerfed in Final Fantasy XIV while it's current since I believe 2016, so 6 years. That's pretty substantial. And this reduced the boss's health in phase 1 by about 1.5% and by just about 1% in the second phase, which sounds small, but is actually a massive nerf. In that first phase, that's the equivalent of about 8 more GCDs on every player, and in the case of the second phase, it's about 3 or 4 GCDs per player across the entire group. It's very big. Now, that being said, Yoshi-P likes to provide explanations for everything. So in the latest post, he goes over why they did what they did, which we already know, but he retouches upon it. Why they took this particular route in nerfing the fight and kind of the decisions that went into that. And probably the hottest topic, why they didn't just do more job balancing as opposed to actually adjusting the encounter. There's a few things in here that might be surprising people newer to the game, but stuff that we had already known that the development team kind of thought or operated under the assumption of. So I'll be going through the whole post, giving you my thoughts on the various statements, and, well, then you'll go to the comment section and either agree with me or flame me. It's the internet. Who knows? It's a toss-up. So we're going to read this word for word so there is no confusion at all. So it's going to be a little bit longer of a video, as if you're surprised. Hello, this is Naoki Yoshida, producer and director of Final Fantasy XIV. There has been a lot of discussion surrounding our explanation for adjusting the HP of the boss in Abyssos the 8th Circle Savage in patch 6.21, as well as the necessity of the adjustment itself. Firstly, please allow me to apologize for the disruption caused by this balancing issue and for any offense resulting from the insufficient explanation we initially provided. In this post, I hope to clear up any misunderstanding as to how and why this adjustment was made. Nothing to discuss here, just stating that it's a follow-up to the first post, which we've already gone over, and gone over the subsequent 6.21 patch notes themselves. So, reason for the HP adjustment. As was explained in the patch 6.21 notes, a miscalculation on our part resulted in the boss's HP being roughly 1% too high in comparison to the difficulty of the previous 4th stage Savage raids. We do, of course, understand and appreciate that many players nevertheless honed their ability rotations, raised item levels, and repeated the fight over and over in order to claim victory. Having the HP set to this higher value, however, had the undesirable consequences, can't read apparently, including certain jobs being excluded from party recruitment and a growing dissatisfaction with the overly punishing degree of difficulty. As our miscalculation was the root cause of these issues, we decided that the best course of action was to explain our mistake and correct the inflated HP to the value it should have been in the first place. This type of correction has little precedence in Final Fantasy XIV's development, and although the decision was made after considerable debate, we once again apologize for the impact it had on player enjoyment. So there's a lot to unpack here. Of course, at the start, they are just restating why they did it, that it was roughly 1% too high, and that they're glad that people still overcame this challenge and managed to defeat it. However, two very important notes. Certain jobs were being excluded from party recruitment, and a growing dissatisfaction with the overly punishing degree of difficulty. Now, I, of course, have had plenty of experience with this encounter, probably far more than I wish I'd had in the last couple of weeks, but I'm going to tackle the second point first because it's a little bit easier. A growing dissatisfaction with the overly punishing degree of difficulty. I actually didn't hear this very often. Most people seem to agree that the first phase of the fight was incredibly well designed and the perfect difficulty for a final tier. It was just that the DPS check was slightly too difficult. It also, of course, ties into point number 1 with certain jobs being excluded and that some game mechanics or some fight mechanics were actually too unfriendly towards certain jobs and roles. And again, because they have a job balance section later in this post, we're going to kind of dig into that there because there's so many things to say. I don't even need this, honestly, this post as a background to have that as its own video. It's its own thing. So I don't think anyone really thought the fight was too hard, so much as just the damage check was more severe than people had anticipated, especially after having the tome gear. This, of course, then leads to people trying to find better job combinations and jobs being shunned out of content, which of course is point number 1. Now, that is a discussion that goes a lot deeper than just saying jobs are being excluded. It's something we fundamentally need to look at across role design and individual job design. And like I said, we'll save that for the job balancing section a little bit later. Now, the source of the miscalculation. We, of course, made jokes saying that the development team just got too good. However, they dig a little bit deeper into this, and while that is technically a true statement, it's how they actually go about the final adjustment for the encounter based on the dev team's success with the quality assurance and making sure the fight works overall. The issue was touched upon in the patch notes, but allow me to explain our balancing process in further detail. Firstly, the development team bases adjustments on the following premise. First, the top percentage of players are overwhelmingly better at the game than we are. We regret not stating this more clearly in the previous explanation, but said premise is the reason why we do not release content tuned precisely as it was when the battle team's balanced testers cleared it. It's funny because this is a statement that's only true of the raids. When it's come to 4-man dungeons and other content that is generally considered easier across the community, or that is factually easier, 4-man dungeons, yeah, we don't have Criterion yet. They often go the other way with it. They often bring it down a lot compared to what the battle testers experience. You know, it's normally way harder in the earlier implementations. These, they come to like a final amount. They say this is the right amount, and then they explain what they do after that fact. So they just accept that the player base is generally better than they are. So it's not their dev team being so good that they make the rest of the community look bad. That's only step one, is accepting that other people are better. This is the point where it probably got out of hand. In fact, where it did get out of hand. We always add a little bit extra to the boss values before rechecking the fight and releasing it live. So important thing to note, they add a little bit, but they do also say they recheck it. Very important thing to not miss. The team responsible for balancing boss fights does so without debug commands and at the appropriate item level, employing available materia, foods, and medicines while experimenting with mitigating actions and various job compositions. Yet we recognize that player skill far exceeds our own. If we were to ship content with the same values which challenged our battle team, the top raiders would be deprived of that by the skin of your teeth victory in the initial week of release. Based on the team's skill and our experience, that little bit extra usually translates to battle tester clear values plus 1 to 2% health. There is a lot to unpack in this individual paragraph that we have here. First of all, appropriate item level. That means that their battle testing team cleared it at item level 610. I wouldn't be surprised if they still just use the extreme trial weapon, but that minimum item level is where their tests largely focus around. They meld, they eat food, they use pots, and of course they need to mitigate, and they have to do various job compositions. Now, that's not to say that they're going to go in and be red mage, machinist, like summoner, reaper, warrior, paladin. I don't know, I guess what are the weak healers? I like all the healers. White mage, sage. I don't know, I don't even think that's the weakest one. It's not to say that they're going to go that far, but they mix and match jobs across various job compositions so that they're not only a stacked team. They're not warrior, they're not Dark Knight, Gunbreaker, monk, black mage, dancer. Well, I'm sure they did this at some point because it sounds like a pretty reasonable comp. Random other job. Like they're not just stacking the strongest jobs and then testing it and saying, that's fine, ship it out. They're doing it across various job compositions. But that being said, when you add 1 or 2% to that, it kind of eliminates a lot of the effectiveness of doing that kind of test. They recognize that player skill far exceeds their own, and if they were to ship it, then it wouldn't have that by the skin of your teeth victory. That is a big part. A lot of people really do enjoy that in that first week, especially when going for that world first clear and being the team that figured it out and just kind of managed to get something going in that first week. So they add 1 to 2% onto the boss's health, and they've done this for years now. And we know this for a fact because this is the process they set in place after Gordius. For those of you who weren't around, back in Heavensward, the Gordius tier released, and it is notoriously both the best and worst tier that has ever released. The third encounter is largely applauded as one of the best encounters they've ever designed, especially for an on-release piece of content, while the fourth and also second encounter are largely criticized to be two of the worst encounters that we've ever had. The fourth encounter in particular being one that was largely criticized. We found out during the 3.1-ish patch cycle during a live letter that the dev team had never cleared the Manipulator, the final encounter in Gordius, without debug mode off. They had only done it while being completely invincible to make sure the mechanics were sufficiently completable, like just trying to test, success and failure conditions. As such, what released was an absolute mess. They swore they would never do that again after Gordius, and this is the result. This is how their process has developed since then. We've known this for quite some time, but we didn't know the exact amount of HP value that they generally added on, or that they even added on an HP percentage value in the first place. So, a little bit of history about how we got to this point as well. I feel like it gives it a bit of context. The final values account for other mathematical factors too, of course, such as the estimated damage the party could deal from the moment of victory to the end of the time limit, as well as total burst damage potential based on frequency and amount inflicted. Basically, they're taking into the fact that what the mins and maxes are and what burst windows can generally look like. This is them just stating that they understand there's a range, that it's not just one set value, and this is always what people are going to be achieving every single time they play. So while yes, under this, theoretically, if you had like a super low crit run, even if you played well, it might cost you the run. But on average or above for crit rate or direct hit rate, on top of how well people actually perform in those burst windows, you should have a pretty consistent clear rate. So these numbers, these various calculations are based on what we were referencing when we said that the team's performance was higher than anticipated. In case you missed the initial explanation, the dev team that QA'd this essentially just played better. And again, they go into that a little bit more here and in the previous post. This latest installment features a boss closely tied to the dark past of a major character, and so we were focused on making this battle even more of a challenge than usual. As such, the battle team spent an inordinate amount of time together designing and testing the fight mechanics, which in turn led to them improving party coordination and communication beyond what they might usually achieve for a given boss fight. Fun little thing about that, it just goes to show you that if you're willing to put in a little bit of work, that you too can improve to the point where you make the fight an absolute nightmare for a lot of people on week one. But it's good to see that the team actually took this extra effort to try to be a more coordinated, better performing team overall, which will likely affect how they have to do things going forward. If this team is able to be this good more consistently across all the encounters going forward after testing this individual encounter and getting to this point, then we might see some changes to the way they just have to do everything going forward, which they were already going to have to do if they're going to keep this 1 week delay anyway. Final adjustments were, however, still based on the team's victory data, and so the little bit extra we added for the release proved to be a little bit too much. It's just crazy to think. There's not really much to say about that I haven't already said. It's just, it's really cool to see that the dev team got that good at the fight, that it was just deemed a little bit too much. Reasons aside, our adjustments were off by a crucial 1%, and we again offer our apologies to those whose gaming experience was adversely affected by the correction and insufficient explanation. Basically apologizing for nerfing it because they know that that's actually majorly discouraging to a lot of people. And also just in general for the 1% screw up in the first place. They're just apologizing for both of those, totally warranted. A high difficulty raid is a special kind of battle. We want players to enjoy a satisfying hard-won victory, and we keep that ideal in mind when making tweaks and balance adjustments. Although we failed to walk that delicate line this time, the experience will help us to design a more perfectly thrilling battle in the future. You know, learn and live. Live and learn, I suppose. Sonic. Anyway. Nothing else to say about that. They just said that this will affect the process going forward so they can make sure they make a better encounter. I wish I wasn't congested for the entirety of this video. It's awful, let me tell you. Okay, this is the part that people are talking about. Why adjust the duty rather than job balance? In the 2 weeks before that adjustment was made, the number of tinfoil hat theories or subsequently job discussion that wasn't tinfoil hat was massive. Everyone thought maybe they secretly shadow tuned it for the new gear, and that was making it a much tighter check for everyone. Maybe they thought that they had just, that the job balance was just that screwed up, that it was going to be way too difficult to clear with the various jobs. And everyone was pointing fingers at each different part, but in reality, it was a little bit of everything. There are jobs that are underbalanced. The fight was overtuned, but not intentionally, it would appear. Well, not intentionally for gear, intentionally based on their usual dev practices, and that just ended up going a little bit too far. So they, of course, have to address the other half of the equation. Why didn't they adjust more jobs? People saw Paladin and Warrior buffs and were like, I mean, yeah, those jobs needed it, but Red Mage, Machinist, Reaper, maybe even? Which, Reaper, that's a different discussion. But besides the point, let's get into their reasoning for this. And the reasoning is sound, but I don't agree with some of the in-between text. When balancing jobs, each job's base damage numbers at the applicable item level are adjusted with respect to the difficulty of playing that particular job and its rotation, as well as its support actions and their effects. That statement might sound like news to some of you, but we knew this already because they've said this before. So it's not a surprise. However, the last time they said it, which was actually quite some time ago at this point, I remember they said it during Heavensward at one point even, and I remember being in Idleshire having the same conversation. And nobody agreed with it back then. None of the high-level players agreed with it because difficulty of rotation doesn't account for the average skill level of the community. On top of that, it means that you could play one of the easier jobs super, super well and not be up to par with what people are expecting of you even then. It also makes it sound like if a job is too easy, it just has to be worse. The problem is the way that it reads, which, as someone who's of course been around, I know that it's not intentionally being read this way. I know that it doesn't intentionally mean, yeah, if your job is easy, you need to do bad damage. That's not what it translates to. They obviously want to balance it across the other jobs and the roles, and they of course have to take into consideration the effects of their support actions, anything that they bring to the raid. They don't just want to have everyone at a flat damage level and then just give you different tools. That being said, I understand somebody who hasn't heard this before, hasn't read anything like this before, being a little bit miffed at that. So next, naturally, the above factors are also affected by the mechanics and combination thereof at work in each battle. That was the sentence. Meaning that every job's numbers will not necessarily be at ideal values during all available battles. In addition to this inherent variance, there are indeed times where our calculations or adjustments are incorrect, producing damage numbers lower than intended and requiring subsequent strengthening of a job. This is especially true in P8S. And it's something that's more true by the patch. So one of the biggest things that used to kind of keep the game in check was melee uptime. Fights would have reasonable hitboxes. Sometimes they'd be bigger, sometimes they'd be smaller. And they designed mechanics where melees could not absolutely get 100% uptime without being kind of overly skilled and really know the fight, even tailor mechanics to do it a little bit better. What that means is that while these players that are going their extra mile in order to get melee uptime can really perform at these extreme levels, it kept it on average across the rest of the community more reasonable, within range of each other. And realistically, when you're looking at comparing jobs, you can't only compare at like 90, 95, 100% of the maximum potential. You kind of have to factor in that kind of 60 to 75-ish range in order to understand where is even just slightly above average, how they compare to each other. That's a healthier place to be making those comparisons that don't involve, you know, getting low crit rate or high crit rate or which abilities crit, which is really where that super top percentage ends up kind of differentiating itself on top of how consistently they're able to play. And this fight's just not good for some things. So for this fight in particular, casters do not have that fun of a time. Not to say that Black Mage, Summoner, and Red Mage can't get around the fight, navigate the fight, keep their uptime, plan their, you know, instant caster movement. They can do that, absolutely. But does the fight kind of promote a healthy interaction with that? No. But meanwhile, the boss has a massive hitbox, and you can literally full melee uptime almost the entire encounter. I think there's like one point where you just might lose a GCD, and sometimes when you turn around for one mechanic, depending on how brave you are, that might delay a GCD or two. But that's about it. And it feels like that factor was not present in their calculations at all. Because if melees are going to be that good, or going to be that reliable at staying in range, then your casters and your range need to be given tools that are appropriate to actually dealing with that, or they need to be, excuse me, brought up to, I guess, play to that norm a little bit better. So it's a really, really tough thing that is accentuated in this encounter. Sorry, I did take this off my ear because I felt like I was shouting a little bit too loud. So yeah, it's just one of those things that's tough to balance around, but is not always something that is consistent. So that's why they talk about whether or not it's about their calculations being off or the encounters themselves just not being designed well for certain jobs. In this case, when considering job balance more broadly, the jobs that needed emergency adjustments in this fashion were Paladin and Warrior. I actually do agree that of all the jobs, those two probably needed help the most. Amongst the DPS, most people are funneling into the melee DPS or even Black Mage, whereas the rest of the DPS are kind of just picking up scraps here and then. Because of that, Dancer inadvertently is stronger because it provides buffs, so the people that are being fed are making the Dancer stronger. Bard is the same way. Really anything with a damage buff is consequentially getting stronger by those players that you're focusing getting stronger. With the tanks, they weren't getting anything in the first couple of weeks, unless you were like in the party finder and you just rolled high. So the discrepancy between Dark Knight and Gunbreaker and Warrior and Paladin was way more obvious. It was just a place where you could so easily make an improvement and get a better overall output with minimal effort. So I do agree that that was the most urgent thing they could have done with those two jobs. However, the aforementioned issue with Abyssos the 8th Circle Savage also caused certain jobs to be better suited to the raid than others and made the damage check required to clear extremely strict, resulting in a situation where players felt obligated to choose jobs with higher damage output when attempting the raid. This is completely on point. We just talked about that a second ago. The fight is just not conducive to certain jobs and is too conducive to already high damage dealing jobs like melees. And that just creates that massive imbalance that creates so many issues. Attempting to ameliorate this by buffing certain jobs without making changes to the raid itself would have negatively impacted overall balance within each role, and likely resulted in disappointment for those whose jobs are already dealing sufficient damage for the raid and therefore received no adjustments. Unfortunately, adjusting all jobs in such a short period is also not feasible. So before we get into the next point, there's a lot to unpack there. Again, first of all, the idea that other jobs got a buff, why didn't I get a buff? That's something that happens that when you're an experienced MMO player, you kind of laugh about it when you see people make statements like that. But we all know that it happens. You know, like Black Mage, you know, oh, it's doing super good in the raids. You know, it's doing so much damage. And Summoner and Red Mage, their res isn't as useful. So what do? They bump up Summoner and Red Mage. And then the Black Mage players go, well, you know, I don't have a res. So, you know, I should have all this damage. We did that Black Mage, Red Mage, Summoner song and dance about mobility versus difficulty playing versus the ability of a combat res. We've done that song and dance plenty of times before. So I get what he's saying there. But that being said, if your job is already doing well, you shouldn't be complaining. And subsequently, it shouldn't be a concern for the devs, because people run their mouths about stuff all the time, even when it is not how it works. So I get it, but I'd say move past it. I say don't listen to that particular group of individuals. Look at the numbers, make adjustments that are based on the numbers, not on people being blah, blah, blah. Also, adjusting all jobs in a short period of time is not feasible. True, but much like the previous statement, when you don't buff jobs that are underperforming, but do buff some jobs that are, people also get upset about that. This time a little more reasonably. You know, if Machinist players are like, oh man, maybe they'll buff me, and then they see two other jobs get a buff, and they're just like, oh, not again. That is equally as, you know, feels bad man kind of moment. So I feel like making more adjustments simultaneously as opposed to rushing some adjustments and not making others has its own negative repercussion that maybe they should have considered that as well. Negatively impacted the overall balance within each role. I don't agree with that statement either, because the way that the players perceive balance within a role is so, I feel like, not in line with the way the devs do it. So, for example, Reaper, people are asking for Reaper buffs. It's one of the higher ADPS/RDPS jobs across the entire thing, across all the jobs. You know, sometimes maybe competes with Black Mage on some fights, but all 5 of the melees are in the top slots for the most part. But people want Reaper adjustments because within the melee role, it's not performing well enough. If you were to buff Reaper, I don't think it upsets the balance of any of the other melees. It just brings Reaper up to that level. When it comes to the other roles, ranged physical, machinist is the quote-unquote selfish DPS and is often shunned. Even if a well-played machinist can do decently, it's Bard and Dancer are just universally able to capitalize on a stronger team more easily, and there's enough of that out there that even amongst players not performing at a higher level, they are still more sought after because it's like a trickle-down effect of the high-tier players influencing the lower-tier players. So if you bring Machinist up to a more Black Mage-ish level, like it, you know, like the role kind of states that it is, or like the job states that it is, the selfish damaging DPS minus 1 room-wide or 1 raid-wide damage mitigation, I feel like you... How do I say this? All you do is you make the top group happy, which trickles down to everyone else. And that doesn't upset the overall balance, I don't think. I think it just corrects kind of a community interpretation of how the job is performing, even if a lot of the players being affected by it don't fully understand those repercussions and just kind of repeat what they're hearing. You know what I mean? Same with the casters. Like if you buffed Red Mage in this patch, you might subsequently want to buff Summoner as well because they are fairly close to each other in the standings, but that doesn't upset the overall balance as much as it used to. I know that we just had that whole talk about how Black Mages used to get, you know, very nervous about Red Mages or Summoners being so close to them in damage, given how easy they were to play and how difficult Black Mage was before. But Black Mage has gotten a lot easier to play, or a lot easier to at least learn how to play and optimize on than it used to be. So there's a big question mark about how much this element factors in versus the element they spoke about before of it being based on the difficulty of playing the job. And I think they need to more accurately draw the lines for each job, for the community. Because I think we're all speculating about how they perceive some of the jobs based on those results when using this as context. And that's just leading to more confusion amongst the players who are playing at the top, which again trickles down to everybody else. So, a lot of things in play here that I think are just not on the same page between the community and the dev team. And I think this is something that can be resolved. I think it's something we wanted resolved a long time ago. I think we've had difficulty in getting to that point. But as we've seen, sometimes all it takes is just one major event to really get us to that point where we feel more connected with the decision making. So maybe this will be that point. I'm hoping that it is, but we're still not even done with the post yet. So I should probably finish that before I kind of go into what sounds like an outro. So the root cause of the issue was a mistake in balancing the duty, and an immediate fix that maintains role balance was required. So that's why they made the Paladin and Warrior changes. But if the root cause of people really having the uproar was the fact that some jobs were being excluded from the raid and were not performing as well in the raid, then obviously nerfing the raid is the most important thing, because across the rest of the game, nobody cares. No, like there's no reason to exclude jobs from like the extreme trial or something. In logic, that makes sense. But again, if people at the top say something about a job, it trickles down and it trickles into other pieces of content. Because of that, while this is logically the correct decision, by only fixing the thing that was at the heart of the issue, it causes the time that it had as it was caused other issues that forced their hand in making more adjustments. Because at this point, so many players have heard word of Machinist not being strong enough or Red Mage not being strong enough, and that's affecting everything. So a root cause is great to fix, but you have to fix the consequences of it as well. And it brought to light these things, and now those things 100% need to be adjusted. It is a game design fundamental as well as our policy that rather than adjust the jobs to suit each battle, we balance the jobs independently and only then set the battle content difficulty. Completely agree with that decision in a normal circumstance. Changing the job balance for one single duty would end up causing more problems than it solves, and so we decided to address the problem in the manner we did by ameliorating the root cause. I appreciate that regardless of our rationale, the issue has been a source of frustration for many, and I apologize for that. I hope, however, that this has helped clarify our approach. It does. And again, that sentence, if it wasn't about something so specific, or that paragraph, I should say, would be completely logical. But that's just not how it works when you get to a large and ravenous player base. It's an unfortunate thing that they have to deal with, but it is truthfully something they have to deal with. If people do not see machinist buffs in 6.25, if people do not see red mage buffs in 6.25, potentially other job buffs or adjustments as well, people will be livid. Now, I will say also that if by 6.3 some things aren't done, oh boy, we know Paladin's getting light reworked in 6.3, but I think a lot of people are just really looking at machinist. And there's another issue I have not even touched upon in this video that is more about general job design and not about the particular results of Endwalker's job balance. So we probably need to get to those as well. Either way, I hope they recognize that and they don't just say, okay, we fixed it and move on, because I feel like we have seen that in the past, and this is not a time for that. This is a time to showcase understanding and make adjustments. They said that there was no way they could have had that much turnaround on that many jobs. That was not feasible to balance too many jobs in such a quick time period, which hopefully means by 6.25, we will see at the very least some band-aid fixes that make players of certain jobs more content with how they're actually performing, especially going in to the 4-man Extremes and Savages with Criterion and Criterion Savage. In conclusion, the adjustments to Abyssos the 8th Circle was never intended to be a nerf, but merely the correction of values that were set inappropriately for a 4th stage Savage raid to begin with. Okay. Nevertheless, I understand that feels like a nerf to those who worked hard and were on the verge of clearing the fight as it was originally implemented, and I regret having caused such disappointment. As we strongly wish for you to continue enjoying fiercely challenging Savage fights, particularly in the early days after release, we will do our utmost to further improve the tuning of these battles. Furthermore, we will strive to better understand what our players think about such issues and improve our operational protocols, perhaps by waiting a week before implementing fixes, in addition to providing details on our perspective. So that if we again find ourselves in a similar situation, we may arrive at a solution that is more satisfying to everyone. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I sincerely apologize for any disruption that our error may have caused to your gameplay experience, and appreciate your patience. Naoki Yoshida, Final Fantasy XIV producer and director. Now, in that entire conclusion, the only thing that really stands out is the improving of their operational protocols, perhaps by waiting a week before implementing fixes, in addition to providing details on our perspective. So perhaps by waiting a week before implementing fixes, I can't help but wonder if that's a week more, like as in that the fight wouldn't have been nerfed until, 3 or 4 weeks after the patch came out instead of 2 weeks like it was. It makes sense because as more gear becomes available, people might naturally have less complaints just because the gear is alleviating some of the concerns, and the people who are looking to get those early clears don't feel like their efforts were kind of undermined just a couple of weeks into the fight actually being out. But it's not 100% clear here. I'm largely just trying to infer what he means just based on that small statement, which is, viable to be inaccurate, or my assessment is viable to be inaccurate. In addition to providing details on our perspective, they're doing that right now. So that's fine. But again, operational protocols is one thing, but to better understand what our players think about such issues is something that the team, they're hit or miss depending on the topic. A great example would be adjusting Dark Knight and having Blood Weapon to be stacks, but Machinist not getting a similar adjustment. I even directly expressed that the players had interest in this adjustment for Machinist during my Media Tour interview. And it was kind of just not really swept under the rug, but it was given kind of a, we don't want all jobs to be the same explanation. But at the same time, it was absolutely causing stress with players who were maybe interested in the job or currently playing it, especially if they didn't live in low ping scenarios that made it feel comfortable to play. So there is that time where they see it and they get it and they make the adjustment, like with Living Dead and Blood Weapon. And then there's times where it just doesn't seem to get through, and Machinist seems to consistently be the job that just doesn't get through. I mean, you look at Machinist and the job doesn't even have that like marriage of single target and AoE that every other job got in Endwalker. Almost every job now, it's seamless going between single target and AoE, but for Machinist, it's like you're playing two completely different jobs. Theoretically, with the old designs, it didn't really stand out, or it wasn't that bad. It was like, oh, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it's doing okay. Whereas with every other job, it's now, again, just a super simple experience. But for some reason, Machinist keeps falling through the cracks of adjustments that other jobs are seeing, and updates that other jobs are seeing, and modernization that other jobs are seeing. And I think that's why it's kind of the crux of the entire conversation, and it's just incredibly strange. There's so many things I could talk about here. I didn't talk about 2-minute buff alignment. I didn't talk about the adjustments they made going into Endwalker and how they've actually panned out. And this video is already half an hour long. It's just such a deep and interesting topic in a game that is otherwise not that imbalanced. It's imbalanced relative to what we're used to, but comparatively to experiences people may have in other sections of the gaming world, we're doing relatively okay. And so this is basically just exciting from that perspective. It's something a little more than we're used to. And besides, a lot of us like driving discussion on the game anyway. It's healthy for the game. It helps the game. It gives people who otherwise don't know these types of things more insight into how we feel about the game and how the devs approach the game, as is evident from this post. But man, yeah, they just gotta communicate a little bit better. And this is a good communication, but it's a one-way communication. And I feel like we need a better avenue for two-way communication that is not just post what you think on the forums. I don't know. I wonder how things change going forward, because there's no doubt they see the uproar people are having about this post, about Machinist, about different jobs, and do nothing. Well, with Machinist, maybe they'll do nothing. I don't know. It seemed to be the case thus far. But in theory, it won't be nothing. So with that, what a post to go over. I think I got to talk about the 2-minute thing in a separate video altogether, because it is a hella interesting topic to actually talk about. But with that, let me know what you thought about this post in the comment section of the video below. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned. I've got some more stuff coming just as soon as I catch up to a few things that I got to take care of in my own time. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video. And until then, take care.